Have you ever wondered about the roots of one of the most complex conflicts of our time, the Syrian Civil War? The year was 2011, a time of change and upheaval in the Middle East known as the Arab Spring. Countries across the region were being swept up in a wave of popular uprisings against long-standing regimes. Syria was no exception. The Syrian conflict began as a ripple in this larger wave, sparked by peaceful protests in the southern city of Daraa. Citizens, inspired by the winds of change blowing across the Arab world, took to the streets to voice their discontent with the government of President Bashar al-Assad. They had hoped for reform, for a respite from years of economic hardship and political repression. But the government's response was brutal and swift. Rather than dialogue, it chose bullets and batons. Protesters were met with force, their cries for change drowned out by the sound of gunfire. Peaceful demonstrations quickly turned into violent confrontations. The spark had been lit, and it wasn't long before it ignited a full-fledged civil war. This wasn't just a battle between the government and its citizens, it was a struggle for power, for control, for the very soul of Syria. The conflict didn't remain confined within Syria's borders, it spilled over, drawing in regional and international players. Countries like Iran and Russia lined up behind the Assad regime, while others like the United States, Saudi Arabia and Turkey threw their support behind various opposition groups. The conflict wasn't a simple binary of good versus evil either. It was a tangled web of alliances and enmities, of shifting loyalties and treacherous betrayals. Each side had its own agenda, its own vision for what Syria should be. And so, the stage was set for a conflict that would draw in a multitude of players, both regional and international. A war that would not only devastate Syria, but would also send shockwaves across the world. But that, dear listeners, is a story for another time. For now, we leave you with this: the roots of the Syrian Civil War, a crisis that continues to unfold even as we speak. But how did a local conflict escalate to a global crisis? Let's delve into this. The Syrian Civil War, initially a local dispute, quickly spiraled into a complex web of alliances and conflicts, involving various factions and global powers. The escalation of the war was marked by the rise of multiple groups, each with its own agenda, battling for control and influence over Syria. One of the major players was the Free Syrian Army, a group composed largely of defected Syrian armed forces personnel. Their goal was simple: to bring down the government of President Bashar al-Assad. However, the Free Syrian Army faced stiff competition from other factions, most notably the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. This extremist group took advantage of the chaos, seizing large swaths of territory in Syria and Iraq and declaring a so-called caliphate. Then, there were the Kurdish forces. Predominantly operating in the northern regions of Syria, they sought autonomy and protection for their people, often clashing with both the Syrian government and other rebel groups. However, the war was not just a local affair. It quickly drew the attention of global powers, transforming Syria into a battleground for geopolitical interests. The United States, for instance, supported the Free Syrian Army and Kurdish forces, aiming to curb the influence of ISIS and the Assad regime. On the other side of the coin, Russia and Iran threw their weight behind the Assad government. Russia, in particular, conducted numerous airstrikes against rebel-held areas, claiming to target ISIS but often hitting other opposition groups. In this tangled web of alliances and rivalries, the lines between friend and foe became blurred. The war ceased to be just about Syria. It became a proxy war, a stage for global powers to flex their muscles and assert their influence in the Middle East. The Syrian Civil War went from a local uprising to a global crisis, with each faction and global power pulling the strings of this tragic puppet show. As the conflict dragged on, it became less about Syria and more about a geopolitical tug-of-war. But what about the people caught in the crossfire? As the Syrian Civil War raged on, it was the civilians who bore the brunt of the conflict. Homes, neighborhoods, entire cities were reduced to rubble, and millions of Syrians found themselves in the midst of an escalating humanitarian crisis. Many were displaced within their own country, forced out of their homes by the violence and instability. They became internally displaced persons, or IDPs, living in temporary shelters or makeshift camps, their lives in a constant state of uncertainty. Then there were those who fled beyond Syria's borders, seeking refuge in neighboring countries and far beyond. The refugee crisis was unprecedented, with millions of Syrians seeking safety in countries that were ill-equipped to handle the influx. Families were torn apart, children were robbed of their childhoods, and the elderly were left to fend for themselves. The plight of these civilians was heart-wrenching, their stories a stark reminder of the human cost of war. But amid the chaos and despair, international organizations stepped in, providing much-needed aid and support. The United Nations, the Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders, and countless others worked tirelessly to alleviate the suffering. They provided food, medical care, shelter, and a glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak situation. Yet their efforts were often hampered by the ongoing conflict and political hurdles. Delivering aid in a war zone is no easy task, and many times, those in the most desperate need of help were the hardest to reach. And so, the humanitarian crisis continued, a grim testament to the toll of the Syrian Civil War. The world watched, debated, and deliberated, but the harsh reality on the ground remained unchanged. While the world argued, the people of Syria suffered. Where does the conflict stand today? As we delve into the current state of affairs, it's important to understand that the Syrian landscape is a complex mosaic of control. Government forces, opposition groups, and autonomous regions all stake their claims, creating a patchwork of power that's constantly shifting. The Syrian government, backed by its allies, maintains control over the majority of the country's territory, including the capital, Damascus. However, the opposition forces, primarily composed of rebel groups, continue to hold on to pockets of land, mainly in the northwest. In the northeast, the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces have carved out an autonomous region, striving for self-governance amidst the chaos. Meanwhile, the Islamic State, though significantly weakened, still poses a threat, primarily through sleeper cells and isolated strongholds. Foreign powers too play a critical role in this intricate puzzle. Russia and Iran have been staunch supporters of the Syrian government, providing military aid and diplomatic backing. On the other side, Turkey supports various opposition groups and has launched several military operations to secure its interests along the border. The United States, while initially supporting opposition forces, has since shifted its focus to the fight against the Islamic State and the protection of its Kurdish allies. This international involvement has not only complicated the conflict but also made its resolution more elusive. Amidst this intricate web of power dynamics, ongoing peace negotiations offer a glimmer of hope. Various rounds of talks, under the auspices of the United Nations, have been held in Geneva and Astana. However, these discussions have largely been marked by deadlock and disagreement, reflecting the deep-seated divisions that underpin this conflict. In the midst of all this, the Syrian people continue to bear the brunt of the conflict. Their resilience and hope for peace, however, remain undeterred. The Syrian Civil War remains a complex issue, with no easy solutions in sight. The labyrinth of alliances, interests, and ideologies that define this conflict continue to change and evolve, presenting a daunting challenge for peace. So what should we take away from this? To truly grasp the gravity of the Syrian Civil War, we must dive back to its origins. It began as a peaceful protest in the spring of 2011, a part of the wider movement known as the Arab Spring. Syrians were seeking democratic reforms, release of political prisoners, and an end to rampant corruption. However, the government's brutal response ignited a full-scale civil war. The conflict then escalated, pulling in numerous countries and factions, each with their own agendas, resulting in a complex web of alliances and enmities. The war became more than a struggle for power within Syria. It developed into a battleground for larger geopolitical interests, with devastating consequences for the Syrian people. The humanitarian crisis that unfolded is one of the most severe in recent history. Millions of Syrians have been displaced from their homes, taking refuge in neighboring countries and beyond. The war has left a vast majority of the population in need of humanitarian assistance, with scarcity of food and medical supplies making survival a daily challenge. As for the current situation, the war is far from over. Despite numerous ceasefire agreements and peace talks, the conflict continues to smolder. The future of Syria remains uncertain, with the Syrian people caught in the crossfire of global politics and power plays. But here's what we need to remember. Behind every statistic is a human story. Each Syrian affected by this conflict has a name, a family, dreams, and aspirations. It's essential that we stay informed, not just about the political and military dynamics, but about the human cost of this war. So let's foster a spirit of empathy and understanding. Let's remember that every refugee is someone who, like us, simply wants safety, peace, and a chance at a better life. As we navigate the complexities of our world, understanding conflicts like the Syrian Civil War is a step towards empathy, awareness, and ultimately, peace.